Yes, so welcome back, everybody. This is the fifth edition of Wild Talks, a series of encounters and open conversations that we are holding as part of the Wildcare exhibition that Ana Jara and I are running and in Porto as part of the Porto Design Biennale this year. And it's been really exciting so far. We have had four sessions, and this is the fifth one. It's been one session every week. We have had Pedro Costa opening and the series of encounters, and we had the chance to have that one physically present there in Porto in connection with the opening of the exhibition. And then we have had really nice and interesting talks with Sofia Neupart and Marco Casagrande and Jack Halberstam, and we are moving into a different direction this week, and we are really excited to welcome Aida Sánchez Serdio, who is an educator, a researcher, and a cultural worker in the fields of visual culture, pedagogy, and collaborative art practices, with kind of long and intense trajectory of many years. She's at the moment an assistant professor at the BA in arts in the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya in Barcelona, and has previously worked also as an advisor for the Department of Architecture and for the Department of Education and Publics at Museo Nacional del Centro de Arte de Reina Sofía in Spain, and also as a lecturer at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Barcelona, and as well as Umeå School of Architecture in Sweden. She has also collaborated with and been a member of various number of educational and cultural projects, such as friction pedagogies and contact zone. Most of these experiences in Catalonia, in Barcelona. Her main research field, we could say, is that of collaborative practices within arts and culture, understanding this as a place of knowledge production, political debate, and social transformation. And one of the main reasons for, apart from this trajectory, for having her has to do with her finishing and publishing her latest book on what she calls imperfect education, which we think is a term that in many ways resembles or comes close to the notion of wild that we are after and that we are trying to work together or unwork with our guests. So please welcome Aida, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I mean, I'm really glad and honored to be part of your talks. I think that it's an invitation that is also a challenge in a way, so I hope to be up to it. And yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to what we can explore together regarding wildness and wild chaos and these kind of things, also coming from a different field from yours. So that's also a bit of more salt to the challenge. And as I said, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly think that it is a shift. I was trying to suggest that we have had talks with a filmmaker, with an architect, and with a choreographer or dancer, and also with a queer theorist. And I think that this conversation with you really help us, or I hope that is going to help us shift towards the field of education and pedagogy, which I think is underlying many of the other things that we are trying to do. So even if our exhibition project can be situated or understood within architecture or thinking about the expanded space of architecture and spatial practices, if you want, I want to believe that there is something about education that is deeply embedded in the very main reasons that we were choosing to call it wildcare, and in the choice of stories that we're trying to share. There's something of a kind of educational perspective, or of a kind of pedagogy of space, if you want. And in that sense, I think it's great to have you, because then we can talk about education, and it doesn't have to be constraining the feel of, or the discussion about education to architecture or to the pedagogy of architecture or space, but we can just think about how do we learn together, and that's that's why I think it's exciting to have you. And I mean, we can start in many places, no? But I think probably one of the most useful things is to maybe just ask you to give us a few notes on what you mean with this notion of imperfect education, la educación imperfecta, ¿no? Por una educación imperfecta, which is the title of your book, and in a way also like trying to advance already like ways in which you think that might be connected with the wild. If that's not too much to ask.
No, it isn't too much to ask. Of course not. It's a mouthful to answer, but it isn't too much to ask. Well, the book is called An Imperfect Education, and of course the conversation will not be necessarily about the book, but it's the starting point. My idea was to call it imperfect, not just as something that is not nice or that works perfectly, but also as something that is never finished and it's never coherent. There's in Spanish, there's, when we talk about from a perspective of linguistics, we talk about sometimes about verbs that have this imperfect aspect, and a verb with an imperfect aspect is a verb that refers to an action that is not finished. Like something like, instead of I sang is I would sing. When you refer about the past, no, I would sing every morning to blah blah blah. This notion of I would sing means that you sang a long time or a certain time or several times, but it's not an action that only takes place once. So this notion of imperfection was more to do with something that is not finished, that it's all the time something that it can be closed. It's but also it has to do, of course, imperfection has this notion of something that is not coherent necessarily, and also something that is open. But for me, it was very important to keep in mind this idea of something that is open to failure, especially in these times where we tend to think of education as something that is an efficient method to achieve something, a better society, a better person, a more functional child, or a more functional employee, something that can fix society. And of course, we hope that education can bring something good. Why not? But it's something that can be an intention or an aim, but it's never guaranteed. Thank God, I would say, because it's good that education can be open to failure, even to harm. I mean, education can be very harmful also, depending on how you conceive it. So for me, that was important, as this idea of imperfection. And also I thought that education is a dangerous territory, because it's never safe. I mean, you're never on safe ground. It's not that something bad can happen to you in education, although sometimes it happens. But in general, it's more to do with this notion of a non-safe space in which you are never on the right side of the line of, I don't know, ideological correction or political radicality, because you always are part of the resistance and also part of the disciplining. And I think that it's very difficult to try to cancel this contradiction by trying to be safely on one side or the other. It's like, no, we want this kind of totally untamed education and something that has nothing to do with regulations and so on.
Yeah.
I wonder how it can happen. Could that really be? Could that kind of education exist? And especially, I have lived in institutions forever. I mean, of course, I'm quite aware of the place I'm talking from, and I'm aware that I've never been in this kind of radical experiments, but talking from the place I am, sometimes I perceive that we tend to think of ourselves as like very radical, trying to do this kind of experiments, but we are more honest with ourselves. We have to recognize that we, at the same time, sometimes are disciplining, setting the limits, not letting people think outside our box. And at the same time, or at other times, we really try to find these cracks in the system where we can, find these flight lines where other things can happen. So I think that this is my notion of a dangerous territory. And if you allow me to keep on a little longer, when I was listening to your talk to Jack Halberstam, I loved the way he placed or he put the conflict, and he said, wildness cuts both ways. I thought that that was a very synthetic way of putting it. It can be the force of resistance, but also the return of the colonial, the things that resist and escape, but also the normative swallowing you up again. And this is why the wild is such a dangerous space to be. And I think that this idea of danger was very suitable also because the original title was meant to be Education is Not a Safe Place. Was the title I was imagining for the book. But apparently, I don't know why. I understand that it is a weird title in Spanish. So it seems to be saying something very negative about education. But I think that this is exactly what education is. Education is not a safe place, just as the wild place is not a safe place because it doesn't allow you to be on the right side of the story, but it really puts you in the middle of the contradictions of that story. You can be also the force of disciplining as you are sometimes the possibility of resistance. And this is maybe the summary I would give you to that question to begin with. I don't know if that works in any way.
Yeah, of course it does, absolutely. Like I think it's also super interesting to hear you linking the way that you are seeing education and the way in which Jack is problematizing this space of the wild, or where the wild things are. And I share your concerns in terms of this impossibility of taking sides and or pretending to be able to take sides in that way of like saying, well, you know, I can be on this side of experimentation and radicality, and then we're going to have an education that is really like emancipatory and only emancipatory, and it's only going to be like based on, in a way, we've seen this a few times, that it at least I have been in situations where it falls on the side of wanting to create the space that is completely free, which ends up not empowering anyone because it just creates situations where it's just the voice of the teachers that are like the ones that are going to kind of like discredit certain ways of proceeding and uplifting others, and which is of course a very unsafe place for anyone that is considered a student or a on the other side in those situations, and that's not the solution to the hyper disciplined and hyper regulated spaces of highly institutionalized like educational contexts. So I totally agree with that, and I see that as a dangerous situation, or as a dangerous place. And I also still see, in the same way in which Jack was talking about the wild or wildness, the need to kind of stick to the wild, in the sense of like not thinking that is exhausted. In the case of the wild, it's not exhausted by the way in which it returns to this kind of colonial dimension. And I think in education, there is also a kind of like imperative to stick to ways of doing that that move in search of this generative and lively and open education, which you were also talking about when you were describing your idea of imperfection. You were saying that had to do with not being finished and with not being somehow coherent, and therefore open to failure. And I think that striving for that, so the idea that we are going to strive for that, yes or yes, that is the kind of wild thing for me. That's the kind of wild dimension, because it is by definition against many of the kind of institutional priorities or ways of doing that push us, and then in that sense is kind of resistant, or is kind of so I really like those things.
What I think that it's interesting about the notions that you mentioned, if I may, can I intervene, or were you chasing an idea that will get lost forever if we?
No,
Sorry.
please, just
okay.
jump in.
No, what you were make me think, and the good thing about this notion is that they are probably involuntary. I mean, this imperfection isn't something that you plan. I mean, let's do something that it's not perfected, that it's let's fail. imagine that contradiction. I remember there was this, let's fail, guys. How about that? Failure, by definition, is something that you do not necessarily plan, otherwise you succeed. Imagine, let's fail. Oh, success, we failed. This paradox, sometimes it's almost like a bad joke, right? I'm like a bad comedian now. It's like, but I mean, I really think that it's something that is, this is why it is wild sometimes, because it's not in your hands. It really goes beyond your intentions, even beyond your possibilities. Sometimes you do things, and collectives and collective bodies do things that they cannot do, because it's something that goes beyond what they think they can do or what they even want to do. So yeah, in a way, I think that that's a good thing about this kind of notions you were describing, that it cannot be part of an emancipatory program. It's something that emerges uncontrollably, and sometimes can create a strong frustration. I mean, sometimes faith processes that you might recognize afterwards as very productive because of that failure produce an enormous frustration, and no one would like to go through that again. Although the learning was very intense, and probably more intense if the mechanics of the pedagogical sequence worked perfectly. It was even better that they failed, but of course it was a disaster. It was a disaster for everyone, but the learning was even more intense. So that made me think that learning actually is like a problematic explosion. I mean, this learning that is a product of the process that is well applied. I think that I'm thinking aloud. I mean, it's not something that I have reflected very deeply, but I think that we usually learn by this disciplined study and so on. And I guess that maybe 90% of what we learn is like this, but there are learnings that are very deep because they affect profoundly the subjectivities, that are more or less explosions that might be even painful or go through suffering. This is not to mean that we should make people suffer, because I come from the field of arts, and that's like a kind of cliche that the artist has to suffer in order to learn important lessons. I think that it's basically it's a sadistic attitude towards education, and in the field of arts and all the creative professions, I guess architecture involves, the training of architects involves a lot of suffering and disciplining and working hard. But in the field of artists, the fact that you have to suffer because you have, I don't know, to hone your identity and be stronger and blah, blah, blah. It's basically sadistic, but it's true that sometimes the learning that operates profoundly and that is really disruptive emerges from situations that were not planned, that probably went wrong. And also from this other learning that is more disciplined and fluid. And I don't know, I think that we learn in many different ways, but this kind of conflicts and paradoxical situations are extremely productive, and sometimes leave you frustrated until you reflect, and it's like, okay, I would never go through that again, but oh hell, how much I learned. I don't know.
Well, I was listening to you, and I was thinking one of the ideas that also Jack is capturing with this idea of wilderness is this idea of unmaking, is unlearning also.
Absolutely.
So it's like I'm not someone that is dealing with education directly. So it's kind of, I've passed through, and I've been your colleague for one semester. But it is in a very particular institution, or in a very particular time of an institution, that's UMIO School of Architecture, and it is about, like what Alberto said, taking this education out of maybe an institution, or disinstitutionalize this idea of a certain education with a certain format, and make it wild. That's what we were trying to do in UMIO by that time, I guess. At least your work and Alberto's work is a lot about that. But well, my question is is kind of this kind of education belongs to a certain kind of society, you know. So how can we, you know, integrate these two factors, education and this society? Because like at least the education in architecture has a certain purpose to be part of a certain role in society, and in this mechanization of architectural work. Is this it is allowed to have like that? Well, my question is, if we create another kind of education, we have to create another kind of reality for this education. How do you see? Yeah. How do you see this world in becoming wilder for certain?
I see. I think I can perceive almost 3 questions in what you said. So I'll start with the last one, and I think that question for me is a bit a chicken egg problem. Is society and education what comes first? Before we create a different education, do we have to create a different society, or is it that through education we can change society? I think that's a bit tricky to me. It's not that I'm you know, dodging the question. Maybe we can go back to that. But let me say first that I have to say that, of course, the training of architects, but any education is it's seriously context bound. I mean, the context. Okay. I mean, sorry, I'm going to mention my book again. But when I was writing this book, I was supposed to write a kind of essay reflecting generally on education. And my problem was I don't have that many ideas on education. I know situations and problematics about education in my context. So let's talk about those, because making statements about education in general is a bit tricky. Can I speak about education in China? Can I speak for educators in Latin America? Can I speak for students, I don't know, in Africa? Obviously, I can't. And I understand education not only as a philosophical endeavor and problematics, but also as a strictly historical, sociological, and deeply grounded practices, like a group of practices and problematics that operate differently depending on your context. So that comes as the first reflection for tackling your question. And then about unlearning and undoing, and that's of course one of the core processes that we need to do in education. It's actually, I think that education is all the time unlearning and relearning and unlearning again and relearning again, and that is important. How to do that in institutions? I think that that's a challenge, and maybe that can bring us back to society again after this circle. But thinking of, for example, this idea of a wild education, honestly, talking from a university, I'm not sure I do any kind of wild education at all myself. So I don't talk for others, but talking about myself, it's not that we can be wild exactly or precisely, not really. And I'm also teaching in an online university, so the degree of determination of technocratic processes is so massive that just the notion of wildness in that case, I don't know, what could it be? I don't know. I won't use this kind of protocol. You know, I won't reply my emails this morning. Wow, it's like revolution. So the possibilities of doing something wild are very complicated. For example, we have to plan our courses 1 year before we really teach the course. So then the idea of a possibility of an emerging situation that makes you change all your plans, and the idea of failure when you have planned all the sequence and students are online and they expect to get some kind of result at the end, although you try to open the contents of that process so it is open to what students can explore, the sequence nonetheless is quite close. And I think that this is more or less what happens in institutions. Mine is an online institution, and that is very clear. But I guess that in a different degree or with different nuances, that is what ends up happening in institutions. So this notion of the wild is, I would be very careful when using it. I wish we could open, what I really do think we should do is to create or take advantage of cracks in institutions. And I hope that our actions, and when I say our actions, I'm talking about whoever is involved in that learning situation, not only teachers, also students or managers, whoever is involved in that, like making cracks bigger or finding outside spaces that can really create an other kinds of possibilities within the institution. I'm not sure we can create something really wild, or even if we explore this wildness again, I think that we are faced to this this cutting both ways of the wild. So at any moment we will end up, I don't know, issuing a degree on, I don't know, wildness or things like that, or we create new hierarchies without getting to understand that. So I don't think when we create something while we go out of the university, or I think it's more problematic than that. There's a permanent tension in that sphere of wildness. So going back to society and going towards my silence, I think that I think that we can't wait to each other. I mean, education can't wait for society, and probably society can't wait for education. Let's start wherever we are. I mean, growth always happens in the middle. So I don't think we can find the starting point. Let's start where we are. If you are in an educational field, start doing something where you are and do whatever you can. You probably can't have a revolution in your workplace, because if you succeed in that revolution, you will end up being fired, not being able to affect anything in your institution. So maybe it's good not to be evicted completely from wherever you are, or even maybe you want. I mean, maybe you want to be evicted and start something completely outside of those institutional regulations, but then what kind of organizational regulations are you going to create in that outside place? So anyway, but this was a digression. Society can start in different places, and I think that pedagogy is happening in many places, not only, of course, in in educational institutions, and of course you know that very well. So society is also changing the ways we learn, and many things happen, and many things are transformed and transgressed and thought differently in many places of society. Maybe what would be interesting is to be in touch. I mean, these educational institutions that, or even certain members of educational institutions, I think it's interesting that they get in touch with people in other spheres of society that are changing and thinking things in the same way. That's really productive, I would say.
I was thinking about this idea of cracks that you pictured that could be somehow transformed into spaces of intersection, where you could deal with these, like you said, dangerous territories touching each other, like merging each other. And this might be the places of a certain wilderness to happen between society and institutions that educate. I mean, the exhibition we created is a lot about stories, and these stories, I think most of them capture these cracks, these spaces. There is this educational project, Cidade Abierta. It's a very famous one, but it's also a magical one, because these students, architectural students, are actually building a city, and the city is a city. Maybe it's a real city, I don't know. There is a certain ambiguity. There is a crack between these situations. Can we create another world? I mean, for me, this is the question of Cidade Abierta. So this is also a question for you, Aida. It's like these dangerous territories, these possibilities that are happening once in a while. They are very punctual, I imagine.
Yeah, they are, and they are dangerous for a reason, for many reasons, but we can call them dangerous, and rightly so. For example, when I've found myself collaborating with whatever processes happen outside of the university, I've done it as an individual, not necessarily as a part of a university, because I didn't know how. And but then that involves working long hours, because after your working hours at the university, you have to do the other stuff, which is exciting and opens you up to territories unknown. And then at the end, after some years, you are really exhausted. And then it's like, not only because you're exhausted, but also because then you lose the possibility of really connecting spheres. If I work with these collectives as an individual, I think that the university is missing something, and also the collectives miss something. Why not create the connections also, or at the level of organizations? I think that I'm also always concerned about the structures, how we not only transform people, but also structures, so we can have something that in the long run may not remain, but at least leave something that other people can take, transform, or even destroy if they want to. But I think that sometimes, you know, just doing, I'm not talking about the projects that you mentioned. I'm saying this because I'm going to take a further step, which is that, okay, when I think of connecting the university, because I think that the university has massive resources, not only economical, but organizational, human. I mean, the university is like a confluence of resources that have to be returned to the society. I think that the university has a responsibility to our society. We cannot capitalize those resources. We actually, we should serve the society. I'm sorry, I sound like really old-fashioned, but I think that universities should really serve societies and not themselves, which is what is happening nowadays with this kind of, you know, solipsistic way of validation within universities, in which if I write an article in English that no one will read ever, I get more validation within university that if I write a book to be read generally for, you know, a common reader, that has no value. So in the end, in the long run, if I get, you know, a prize for doing certain things and not a prize for doing other things, I will never do those other things, because they will involve a lot of time and effort that will never be recognized in my institution. That's hell. But still, why do not create these connections? Why do we not, you know, take these resources that are in the university and create something new, connecting with those resources that lay outside of the university, and do something together? And then my conflict, and this is why I say that this is a dangerous territory for me too, again, is that sometimes the university is such a strong institution, has such strong ways of absorbing everything within itself, that in the end we create a hierarchical situation. I mean, the time, if this, for example, if this collaboration happens within the structure of a research project, what will happen probably is that this research project is thought to create the publications that the funding body thinks that should have to be published, which basically usually don't have to do with forms that are non-normative, or forms that are common knowledge forms. It always has to be translated into academic production, although now they tend to say that we also have to produce this kind of more dissemination documents. But I mean, this is totally colonizing. We do not disseminate, we produce knowledge together. So what do we do with this? So my concern here as a member of the academia for many years is that I find it very difficult to, maybe it is because of my inability to do so. Maybe other people do that happily and without effort, but I never seen the way of creating a fair and just relation with collectives that do not have the same hierarchical position or the same power. So we're in a hierarchical position mutually from the point of view of the university, because if you take other perspectives, the others might be in a more prominent position, because I guess that everything has to do with the point of view you consider the relation from. But from the university, I mean, in the end, it's like you capturing social value and other values from these collectives, and then you are transforming them in this alchemy of academia, and then I end up transforming that in something that really consolidates me in the academia. And I think that is so tricky. So again, it's how the wild comes back with a vengeance.
Yeah.
Making you again a kind of explorator, an explorer, you know, with the helmet and everything, moving into the wild of social practices. And given my field of interest, which is our collaborative art practices and engaged practices and social practices in art, as you can see, I walk all the time with this burden, which is not different from the burden of the ethnographer or other professionals of knowledge of the other. And of course, there are ways of operating differently, and there are many people in the university doing things to challenge this hierarchy. But it's hell, because it involves like not turning upside down, but bending all the time the regulations of your institution, bending and hiding and passing and pretending, you know, you live in a simulation, and you don't want to lie, of course, because you can't, it's unethical, but at the same time you have to make things look what they are not, so you can keep doing what you do, and they keep, you know, maintaining the structures or the recognition for whatever you do, like, okay, this is proper academic research, and making it look like proper academic research, it's not always easy. So this is one of my main concerns as a person working in the academia, how to make that happen without entering into totally hierarchical and unfair relationships with collectives, as the ones you were mentioning, Anna, and as the ones you were considering in your exhibition. How do you do that from the university without exploiting them and capturing them into your own nets of validation?
Maybe I'm going to try to maybe rewind a little bit, because I think it's been really interesting now. I've been for a while like just following, and you've been both saying quite interesting things, and it started with this question about education and society, and the need to maybe create another kind of reality if we propose another kind of education, and I think that you've been saying things about that, and I just want to kind of like go deeper into some of those implications, and thinking also, like, of course, like it's a chicken egg question, but it's also like I think that very much in relationship with how do we interpret this term of the wild things, and whether we see it as a kind of totalizing and all-encompassing alter reality which changes everything, or we see it as a kind of situated and partial shift, a kind of excess intensity which manages to do something. And this something doesn't have to be totalizing, it doesn't have to be prominent, even it doesn't have to be revolutionary, but it is still wild in my view, or at least in the way that I want to understand this kind of concept. It is still wild because it rejects, it challenges, or it just simply ignores some of the kind of modes of doing or ways of doing which are supposed to be like established or taken for granted as or quite kind of violently imposed on us. And I think that in that sense, like for me, it's less about the kind of revolution which implies a completely new kind of education, which therefore might imply from some perspectives a completely new kind of reality, but it is a space which can be invented within any situation, and I imagine then options, like completely, like millions of them, when you are speaking about that highly like systematic and controlled educational environment in which you are now with the online education 1 year planning ahead. And I still imagine like ways in which and I know ways in which you're doing things which I would consider wild, no? So that's one thing that I want to do. Then I just wanted to kind of like make a short like detour to reflect on the overinflation of degrees and a kind of educational certificates, as opposed, which would kind of in a way like support this idea of another kind of reality is needed if you want to have another kind of education. But on the other hand, we have examples, quite successful actually examples of completely non-certificate and non-degree based spaces of education and learning that have worked, especially in the arts and in architecture. I'm thinking about Open East School in London, or I'm thinking about examples of architectural educational spaces which have been, like explored or tested in the last decades, where things happen in spite or regardless of whether they are going to lead to a certificate or the degree, and the value and the reason why people want to join, for instance, or have been wanting to join Open East School, had to do with the kind of knowledge that they had, that the experiences that they would get would be relevant, and they would be relevant beyond any degrees or beyond any certificates, or even more, like much more than those degrees. And still, like these were people that were like just joining and spending their time and engagement and resources and energies and intensities to be there, not to get any degrees, but to get what they were going to get, which was the experience of being there with these people. And I think that is wild in my understanding of the wild, in the sense that it's not changing the world, it's not changing the complete totality of the space of education, but it is providing a space where things happen otherwise, and where people meet to learn together and to share resources in a different way. For instance, in the Open School, we know that the teachers and the kind of like coming cohort of students or so-called students, they in a way are the board that chooses the teachers. No? So the cohorts exist first, and they get together and they decide, well, we want these people to come and somehow guide us, no, the next year. And then they kind of plan their year, which I find is a really interesting thing. Maybe there's also, of course, contradictions or problems in that, no? But what I find interesting is that, or what I find wild is that is completely at odds with the spaces of institutional education that are controlled by these needs of producing a systematic trajectory towards a degree or systematic trajectory towards a certificate. So when you were talking about, sorry that it's a detour, but I'm trying to kind of come back to one thing, no, which is this thing of emergence. I was taking a note: emergence versus efficiency. The possibility of creating spaces for learning together, in which it's not so much about the program. Now, you were saying we can't have an emancipatory program, or if we have it, then it's going to be like flawed in a way. But it's more like emancipation will happen eventually, maybe if we set the conditions for things to happen. And that's not a program towards emancipation, but that is a kind of, in my mind, like kind of wild care approach to education, where you care for the situation, for the context, for the dimensions of specificities involved in the kinds of people and in the kinds of things that you're dealing with, and then you allow things to just happen the way that they want to happen. And that might involve failing or crashing or explosions or even suffering, as you were saying, but it might also lead to actually people like actually getting an experience which they can say afterwards they learned from. They don't have a degree, but they have something that they have learned a lot from. And so I think that this idea of emergence, that while education would have a lot to do with emergence instead of with efficiency and program and planning, I find that really like appealing, and one of the kind of connection points or touching points between wild things and imperfection in the context of your book and what you were saying. Sorry that it was a bit maybe complex what I was saying, or too long, but I wanted to get
4
there.
discussions going on at the same time, or successively. Can I go back to the first bit, what you said?
Of course,
of course, this notion of transforming society through education or vice versa. I think that this again is something that still happens, but planning it's quite, in my opinion, is quite problematic. This notion of let's change society through education, because then what we have is this kind of educational innovation. I'm sure that in every country there's projects of educational innovation, and not surprisingly, behind those kind of projects are the foundations of banking companies or I don't know, communication companies. At least in Spain is what happens. There's this La Caixa, there's Movistar. All these kinds of companies are backing projects having to do with educational innovation and to create other ways of learning, which again refer to modes of teaching and learning that came from these radical proposals from the beginning of the 20th century. And they take, I mean, they can even quote Freire, you know, or bell hooks, no problem at all, because of course they are good and they mean good, apparently. So yeah, and through this kind of innovation projects, what they want to do, of course, is create a different kind of citizenship, of course, responsible, critical. And what they mean by critical is something that we really need to do. We need to do some research on that. But anyway, they mention criticality as something that the citizen has to have and so on. But I mean, you only have to scratch the surface, because what lays behind that is that you need to produce a new kind of worker, which is innovative, creative, collaborative, flexible, has ideas, and also has this kind of this pressure for emotional education in schools, basically is a way of controlling your frustration when capitalism really reduces you to a pulp after your working hours, in which your very deep self has been exploited to create contents to a kind of, I don't know, a producer of media content, I don't know. But so there's this connection of creativity, innovation, emotional education, and everything. All this, what is trying to create is a new society. So I'm very skeptical about education that wants to change society, although of course it eventually happens. If we educate in a certain way, we have effects, but planning this change is quite dangerous. So this, I totally agree with you that change in education probably is not of a totalizing nature, because it's a bit totalitarian, of course, this notion. And I remember the image that came to my mind sometimes about the position you can have in several institutions in which you live is the termite, the little insect that makes these holes in the wood. So as a termite, you maybe can carve holes and do things underneath that in the end creates a fragility of the whole structure. So I guess that maybe the notion of the termite doing things underneath is particularly revolutionary. I mean, they don't set on fire big wooden structures, but they eat the structure from within, sometimes out of sheer need. It's not that they want to create a collapse. It's like, I need to eat wood, I'm sorry. So they eat the wood, and in the end, it can end up in a collapse, but it's from a very silent enemy within. And then moving on what your reflections have been, the reflections you've been sharing with us, this inflation of degrees, it's really worrying. Not only there is an inflation of degrees and diplomas and so on, there's also an idea of purchasing a diploma, of a degree. So students more and more have an idea of being a customer. They buy an education. I will talk about that later, but they buy an education, and this education has to provide them with a proper diploma or degree or whatever. So this attitude of customer, I have to say, I wouldn't blame the students. I think that the university has brought that on itself willingly. I mean, after all these notions of creating, well, after the Bologna Treaty and all these kind of things, when we created this notion of education as something that has to be useful, exchangeable, and we talk about credits instead of, I don't know, learnings, courses, whatever. When we talk about education as something that is basically economical, that can be exchanged, that can be translated in credits and so on, of course, what you create is a notion of customers. So it's not just to blame on young people trying to find a way professionally, and they need a diploma for that. We created this kind of education of our university. Then what is cancelled there, obviously, is learning. Learning has no importance. I mean, and then usually students think that just because they paid the tuition and they did what you told them to do, then they not only have to have a degree, but they have to have an excellent mark. And so it's like, no, what's wrong, what's lost here? And I think that it's a pity for me, thinking from a maybe romantic point of view. What I really miss from university, and of course the university I studied in was not an ideal university, but I miss the loss of the notion of learning. And we went to courses that we were not enrolled in, just for the pleasure of doing something else or listening to someone we were interested in listening to. And yeah. I'm falling into romanticism, I know, but yeah, I'm sorry. It's really a pity that learning is disappearing really fast from our universities. And then this kind of institutions or organizations or collectives or initiatives that do not award diplomas, I think that, of course, it's important that we group together to learn together and do stuff together. And I think it's very important that they exist, although sometimes, well, anyway, but again, coming from I'm a product of public institutions, from school, then to university. I'm a product of public institutions. So my position is that I want to keep, I want to be in public institutions. I know that they are what they are, but I don't want to lose faith on that. Otherwise, maybe this is a social democratic position, but at the same time, it's not. Let's not abandon that. Let's not criticize public health services. Oh, I'm going to rephrase that. Of course, let's criticize them, but of course, by all means, let's criticize them, but let's not destroy them. Let's not take them down, or let's not think that they are useless because they have become this kind of machines, institutional machines. Yes, they are that, and maybe until the last moment when the institution is totally hell, I will still be here thinking that we have to do something for this. So this is why, although I think those other initiatives are very important and we need to be in touch, at the same time, I would not think that university is lost forever. I would like to believe that there's still some ashes there burning a little bit. And then about emancipation and how to create these spaces of emancipation and letting things happen. But then again, my position might sound a bit conservative, but if you remember that quote by Audre Lorde about how the tools of the master will never destroy the house of the master. Nevertheless, I think that she also understood it in this way a little bit, is that, yeah, but still you need to know how to use the tools of the master. So I think it's important to do other things and open wild things to occur, open spaces for that to occur. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, but it would be good if you could write, a proper administrative text, or learn how to read the proper administrative text, because of course you can do wild writing, but there will be one day in which in your, post box will arrive a letter, because they still write letters sometimes, and there will be a cryptic message telling you something awful that you do not understand. So you better learn the tools of the master too. It's a combination of learning the tools of the master and then allowing for the wild to happen and take us away.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if to just play the game of arguing with these things that you're saying just for the sake of the conversation, but it sounds a bit like the discussion is on these terms of reform of destitution, and just because we had Jack last week, and then he's so into these ideas of destitution, I think it's also important, like in a way, like if we were to follow what he says, and then we were to believe that what is needed is really a process of destitution, in the sense of like dismantling the university, dismantling care systems, institutionalized care systems, in a way, ultimately not to have to expect that letter, no? So that letter will never come again because it's over.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course we will invent that university that you're describing, no? We will just maybe call it differently, or we will actually call it the university again, no? But it will be something else, no? And I find that I don't think that what you're saying is conservative. I think that what you're saying is really interesting, but I find really inspiring to think about that, no? To think about this moment in which we could just live fearless of that letter ever coming, and in that moment where you feel like that, then I think that immediately you just completely change the way you think about how you're elaborating the next course plan, or the next lecture, or the next class, or the next dynamics for meeting some group of students. And then I think that there's a lot of potential in that, no, in that kind of affective shift, which puts us in a different almost like universe, or health, body to body relation with the world, that just allows us to do things differently. Yeah, I think that is also really inspiring. So this destitution, again, not as a kind of like, oh, we are going to kind of burn it tomorrow and everything is going to be over ashes, and then we will kill everyone. No, not in that way, but destitution in this other way, where we can imagine the end of all of those things that are bothering us, that are like limiting us, and we can feel it finished, and therefore dream of other ways and execute other ways of doing. No? Yeah, that was just a kind of maybe rant.
No, I understand. I mean, I totally understand. I would like, I think that's something, in the end, I think that what we think is very much like who we are and what our biographies are. So I don't think that thinking is free, so to say, again. So of course, my thinking comes from my biography, and a little bit from what I am, although I know that whatever we are is not fixed, and sometimes it's not coherent. Well, mostly it's not coherent. So I don't say this as an essentialistic affirmation of I speak my heart and this is who we are. No. What I'm saying is that, of course, we come from where we come, and we end up thinking things because we had this trajectory or that other trajectory. Of course, we can break that a little bit, but yes, I totally understand that my thinking can be conservative, and I'm not afraid of calling it that if it weren't, because now conservative means something really, really, really scary, and I don't, of course, coincide in any way with what conservative means now. But I mean conservative in terms of being. I'm a bit skeptical. I would really like to work. In a way, I think I'm trying to do that, but I'm trying to work for a world in which that letter never arrives, of course. But I'm quite skeptical that it will happen soon. So for the time being, better know how to read that. That being said, at the same time, totally. I'm again a bit skeptical about, and I'm not saying that you're saying that, but certain utopias, I think that come from a privileged position that we have, and I don't believe this world of equal caring relationships, and of course conflicts too, but that can be dealt with in different ways, will come to happen soon, and especially not for people who are really in positions that are exploited and so on. So I would really like to see that, but I don't see that equality coming anytime soon. I'm sorry, I wish I could. I would be much happier if I could believe in that and work in that direction, but I'm scared. I think that we are living in a machine in a grinding machine, really, and we have to work for it not to be that. But I can dream of a utopia in which, I don't know, the property of land is distributed differently, and we can have these cooperatives, that try to create these co-living situations and so on. But at that time, that's great, and it needs to happen, and it needs to push all the time further and further the pressures of, I don't know, capitalistic ownership and privatizing of land or living, blah blah blah. But still, even to do that, you need to know how to deal with regulations and legal regulations, because I think that I've said what I had to say, and it's understood.
And I totally agree. Like I think that it's, again, for me, the same thing as with this wild concept, or wild things concept, that I don't see it as a kind of totalizing alter reality. It's the same with destitution. For me, the key is that this is not a utopia, but it is about a very situated or contextualized, whatever you want to see it, however you want to see it, specific and partial destitution or wild, or engagement with the wild. In the case of destitution, I think it's it's a question, in my opinion, of like breaking down certain things which we have at hand and that are like really bothering us, that are really like keeping us stuck. I think that there's a really nice section where you are saying it in the book, where you talk about how, like, almost like you say that what it comes down to is about radically challenging the ideologies of quality and excellence in education, and opening education to the paradoxes of contradictions, uncertainties, openness, and then those things, they I mean, in my mind, that in a way like involves almost like a destitution of the way the university works today, because it is all built up on the ideologies of quality and excellence and benchmarking and measuring and efficiency. If we manage to kind of find ways in which it's not about that, partially not about that here or there, in your course, in their course, in the way in which we are evaluating but not evaluating, or like we are holding an evaluating meeting but in which we don't evaluate according to these ideologies of quality and excellence, but we evaluate according to other kind of ways, or we just don't evaluate at all, but we have a discussion, no? If we manage to do that, I think we are, in my mind, in my reading, we are destituting the university, and we are, and we don't need to do it utopically, no?
Yeah, certainly. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. I said that we should be a bit ambidextrous. So, because in a way, in order to create those spaces of challenging the excellence and so on, you need actually to be able to manage the conditions in which you operate, so you can create those spaces, and then you can do these things within those spaces. So we need to think with both hands, with the hand that knows the system and the hand that doesn't want to know the system and even doesn't know it. So we work with both hands at the same time, so we can create those spaces. So that would be my position, in a way, to be, maybe it's not resolving the thing, but it's to consider both dimensions. So we don't forget, so we don't create the false impression that we can go without dealing with the system that oppresses us, because even if we don't want to be oppressed by it, we even need to push it a little bit so we can make some space for other things to happen. And I have to do that by knowing that system a little bit, even if it's to overthrow it eventually in the future. I don't know. So yeah, there was and then about evaluation, sorry, I just wanted to mention that, of course, evaluation is super problematic in university, and I guess that everyone having any relationship with academia knows that, what is evaluated and how. And then, of course, the dilemma is, let's get rid of all kinds of evaluation. I don't even want to make this understandable by the institution. Whatever I do, I don't want it to be readable by the university. I want it really to be under the radar, so they do not make any sense of what I do. That can happen. That comes with a price, of course. And then the other position is, oh my God, please recognize other kinds of thinking. Again, is understanding that the university is lost. There's nothing to be done there. So I will get my sari and do what I can underneath. And then the other position is, please, guys, let's understand that there's other ways of thinking. Let's decolonize university. And then again, it comes with a price, because the danger of that is that everything comes super readable by the institution. So again, we have a categorization of what is to collaborate with social organizations. And maybe we'll have, I don't know, rubrics of how to evaluate that. So again, that is a danger, because in a way you push the limits, but then maybe those limits are even more dangerous than the previous ones that were at least were blunt. But if you create a very subtle instrument of measuring, that subtle instrument of measuring it's really something scary. So again, is attention. What do you do? Do you try to change that institution? And if in the end, if I thought that university is lost, the only coherent option for me would be to leave it. I don't think it's honest to be, getting a salary from the university and working for them, and at the same time thinking, oh, university is a shit, I just get the salary and do whatever I can. I don't believe in university, everything is shit, and I do my stuff outside.
No,
I think that is cynical, and I don't think it's fair anyway.
No, I think it is. I totally agree, and I think it's important that what we are doing, whenever we are doing it, is engaged, and that's also, I think, what is at the basis of this notion of wild care. We were calling it wild care, of course, as a response to the curatorial proposition or request that we got from the chief curator, which had to do with an idea of matters of caring. And but I think that the word care could have been changed into something like engagement or even intimacy or even more simply and straightforward, like proximity or something like that, or even attention. These words, I think that they also have to do with the way that we are seeing care, and I think that has to do with what you're saying about being there only as long as you believe that this is actually making any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And in this I also agree. There's something that I would like to touch upon. I know that we are getting messages about the duration of the talks. We have this idea that these talks are quite unscripted and quite open, and this is also, I think, what is making them different in a very, I think, interesting way, and for me, like, quite joyful or pleasant. But we don't want to make them too long, also thinking about our audience and the potential audience of our guests, so that it's not endless. But there's something that I think really interesting in your book, which I would really like to touch upon. And the book is a book about education, and as you were saying before, is a book that is contextualized, specifically adjusting your reflections to the experiences and the spaces in which you've been involved and that you've been close to. So you have this structure where you talk about the university and then the museum, and then, or the university and the school and then the museum, and then the spaces of community action or community development. And when you move to the spaces, I think it's in chapter 2, when you move to the spaces of the school, you do a kind of critique of creativity. And I think this is a really interesting thing for us, because creativity is another thing that is really, like, inflated especially in the world of architecture and architectural education, where there is this very often and still this presupposition of the genius of the architect designer that has it or does not have it. And that is very close to an idea of, like, inherent or born with creativity, that somehow is one of the problematic dimensions. And the other problematic dimensions is a kind of, like, which happens in the other spectrum of, or almost the other end of the spectrum of kinds of approaches to architectural education, where it's a kind of opening up the field to do whatever you want, self-expression, spontaneity, because you have to be creative, and then it's not about anything, but it's about whatever you want it to be, and please just do it, and make as many and produce as many things as possible, and there's no end to it, and I think that those two kind of sides, they have a lot to do with some of the critiques or critical points of creativity that you're discussing. So maybe you want to kind of comment upon that, or
yeah, let's not make it very long, also, as you said, out of respect for the audience. Yeah, totally. I mean, my background is in arts. I studied art, and creativity was like this burden, like a Jesus Christ cross that you had to carry with you. Oh my God, creativity. Am I creative enough? Am I not? So, and it was at the same time something never defined. What the hell was it to be creative? When do you consider something or someone as creative or not? As you said, it's very difficult to, is it total freedom? Whatever you do is creative? Where does it come from, this notion of creativity? So let's not go now into a history of the notion of creativity. But yeah, let's say that my concern was about what I was mentioning before, these new plans of educational innovation, that are backed by important companies and so on, we should make us suspicious from the onset. But still, let's think that they are. The idea is that, of course, they are trying to create this new kind of work. And I remember I was doing some basic research on how it was used in economy. And there was this statement by an economist, a local economist from Spain, saying, any job not related with creativity will disappear in 10 years. But no problem at all, because creativity can be learned. So, so now you have this huge amount of courses on creativity. So how come that you are not tapping all your potential, both as a person and as a worker, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I mean, who can, you cannot believe really this kind of hype of creativity when you have this background. So any use of creativity now, it's by definition crossed or totally mingled with this notion of creativity as the new first source of production. What you call that, when the matter that then you transform into some product, like materia prima, sorry to say that, I don't know the name in English, is the matter that you transform later in a product. So creativity is the new matter that you transform in all kinds of products, material, immaterial, and so on. So that was my main concern. But then my problem, after all, was that, yeah, but still, again, I don't want to throw away university as something that has no use because it's been colonized by these forces of capitalism. But the same happens with creativity. It's like, should we throw away the notion altogether? Let's not use creativity again because it's contaminated, totally colonized by these forces of capitalism. And then my answer is a bit ambivalent as usual, and I really don't know. I don't use it very often because, again, I got allergies from my training as an artist, so I never use creativity. It's like, oh, I had enough creativity, I got vaccinated. I don't need that anymore. And I don't need creativity to understand interesting things that happen. So there's people doing things that are unbelievable, but I don't need to call them creativity to make them valuable. So at the end, what my reflection is like, yes, let's not throw away creativity. What about, I mean, I think that we have forces of we of course can create. It's a non-naive understanding that, oh shit, I know that capitalism is written in my cells already, but is that the only thing that there is there? I don't know. I don't think so. But still, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure we can use creativity just stating, oh, just bear in mind that this creativity that I'm mentioning is not the creativity of capitalism. I don't think we can use creativity with a footnote all the time. I don't think it works. So as I was speaking from the point of view of education, my position at the end was, okay, if I was an educator thinking or working around the notion of creativity with students, I would just work together with them also how creativity is the best way in which exploitation enters their bodies, their minds, and their souls. So you do not believe in any way that creativity is something you possess and makes you, I don't know, a full human being that is completely, self-fulfilled and so on. Creativity is also the way in which you will be exploited in levels that you will never imagine. So also think of creativity as something really dangerous for you. Maybe sometimes you need not to be creative. You need to be resistant and dull. And maybe creativity is it's such a positive term that it has become useless. When a term is exclusively positive, it has no meaning.
Yes.
So no, we need some shadows in this painting. How do we get some shadows back? By reinscribing all this notion of capitalism as the background of creativity and as something. So I think that we need to learn both sides of the notion. It cuts both ways again, creativity.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. I think that you have this moment where you literally say that, no, that we need to somehow refuse to be creative, or that there's moments in which refusing to be creative would be the position to take, and these dangers of creativity as this positive.
Yeah. It was
only
this
positive.
tricky sentence by Foucault when he says that criticism is the art of not being governed in that way.
Like that.
Like that. Yeah, I don't know how the translation works. Yeah, like that. So the sentence that I used was more or less the same because it's quite ambiguous. It doesn't say it's the art of not being governed at all. It's not being governed that way.
Like that.
Sorry.
Way.
Like that. Sorry, the correct translation is like that. So it was basically the same. Is the art of not being creative like that. Because I don't think we have a way of not being creative at all. I don't think we can really push that thing within us. So no, I think that we have to not to be creative like that, or not to believe in creativity. And of course, what we need is a radical critical history of creativity, because it has become also a universal. Like everyone has been creative. You know, during history, back in times, Leonardo da Vinci was creative and said, okay, let's wait a little bit, because I don't think creativity was a word that Leonardo da Vinci had in his dictionary at the time. So maybe we need to do a critical history of a genealogy of the notion of creativity. Otherwise, we universalize the term and we use it as a social medicine and an economic medicine in so many contexts that it doesn't make any sense. Well, it makes the sense of capitalism, of course, but not any critical sense.
Yeah, and I think we were trying to do the same with the word care.
Yeah.
So it serves kind of it fits like the word the wild is serving the word care, or the concept of care, as something to sharpen it a little bit further into this decolonization, politicization or political view on this term. So I mean, it's a very nice conversation. I think we are I mean, we thank you if Alberto doesn't have any question, but I think we can stay with this idea of creativity in the end for this conversation about pedagogies. Thank you, Aida, for this contribution to the Wild Care Wild Talks.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me fail too. I mean, I hope I failed a lot in what I said. So thank you also for that.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Being allowed to fail too with you all together. Thank you. It's been a privilege, really. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Have a nice evening. See you soon. Talk to you soon. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Aida.
Okay, yeah, done.